I'm Larry Dresner. I've been with CPG almost 8 years now. And my position here, I look as a resource to everyone who's a participant in the pension plan, both lay and clergy. And what I mean by that is that any time during a cleric's career, they can certainly call myself or my other colleagues in the department to ask questions about the pension plan, see if there are opportunities to maximize the pension plan. And as you get closer to 65, to see how the pension works with regard to Social Security, claiming strategies for Social Security, your other investments, that sort of thing. So at any time during this conversation today, if you have questions with regard to what I'm talking about, I'm going to keep an eye out on the chat box so that if you have questions, if you want to go on a deeper dive on a topic I brought up, or if there is a question you have that may not be directly covered by the seminar, please feel free to type in your questions during the chat, and I'll do my best to answer them. And I don't want to inundate you with a lot of information, or a ton of it. So my understanding is at the end of the seminar, we're going to be asking you to fill out a survey. And the survey is very important to us because it gives us feedback as to what we're doing good and what could be improved on. And by filling out that survey, you'll get a printout of today's handouts. So without any further ado, let's go to the next slide. The three things we want to cover today is a basic guide to the clergy benefits, the opportunities to earning credited service during times of transition, and any additional retirement savings opportunities. And of course, during this conversation, if we branch off in other topics, that's cool too. Next slide, please. So everything I'm talking about today is covered in this guide to clergy benefits. It's a 46-page PDF that's available for download on our website, cpg.org. And anything I say today can be research or additional information can be covered in this, okay? So that could be a handy resource to have available. And we update it as time goes by whenever we need to. So just to get some basic terminology and concepts down, let's take a moment to review what the pension plan milestones are based on years of credited service. Okay, so the first milestone would be 5 years. If a cleric works for 5 years, they become vested in the plan. Now, if we have someone who comes to the clergy pension plan as a second or third career, and maybe they become ordained and start working at age 62, once they reach 65, they become vested right then and there. So you either need to have 5 years of credited service and or reach the age of 65. Okay. So that also means that if a cleric works for a couple of years, let's say they get up to 4.5 years of credited service, and then for some reason they step back from wanting to continue work, they're not vested, they don't get any kind of benefits. That's not to say that they can't come back in later on and continue working and building credited service. And we can cover that further in the discussion today, certainly if you have any questions about how that works. So the next milestone is 10 years of credited service. So what that means is once a cleric receives 10 years of credited service, they would be eligible to receive the post-retirement health subsidy. So what that means is at age 65, when people become eligible to retire and receive Medicare benefits, we offer a Medicare health plan. Okay, and basically, once you have 10 years, we start subsidizing the cost. So as you get closer and closer to 20 years of credited service and retire, we subsidize more of the cost. So if you were able to get to 20 years of credited service, as of today, the way the pension plan is written, you would receive those Medicare plans at no cost for both you and your spouse or partner. So that's pretty cool. The next milestone is 25 years, and let's skip that for a second. Let's get to 30 years. Normal retirement in the pension plan is age 65. If a cleric wants to retire before 65 without 30 years of credited service, they would receive a pension reduction. If they were to retire before 65 with 30 or more years in, they will not receive a pension reduction. So that's pretty cool. And you can keep working after 30 years of credited service. I've spoken with clerics, and I'm sure you know a few who have 35 or even more than 40 years. But 30 years can be considered a magic number because it allows you to retire early, before age 65, without any kind of a pension reduction. So 25 years secure active status. So what does that mean? There are basically three statuses that we have in the pension plan. You're either active, you're either inactive, or you're retired. So let's put aside retired for now. Let's talk about active and inactive. So in order to stay active, there are some rules that the cleric must abide by. And one of them is to have assessments paid in a timely fashion for their accredited service. If there are no assessments paid for more than 6 months, they become inactive. And we're going to talk about that situation in greater detail and what you could do to avoid that. But the point of this 25 years is, if you have 25 or more years of accredited service, you can never go inactive. Okay, so even if assessments stop paying, if you're 25 years in, you will remain what I call forever active. So I hope that's kind of clear. If it isn't, put it in the chat room and I can go into deeper detail. So let's go into the next slide, please. So again, here we go with the three statuses: active, inactive, and retired. So let's talk about what mandatory participation is, because that could be a question some of you have. So the first one is, you're expected to be regularly employed at least 5 or more consecutive months by the same employer, and you're compensated by your employer. Those must be in place. Then if you have additional requirements, one of the next following ones, one of any of these must be in place. You have a letter of agreement or a contract of employment. You are duly called to your position by your bishop, vestry, or rector. Your position has a formal title. Your employer issues you a Form W-2. You are scheduled to work at least 20 hours per week. So that's mandatory participation to get active, participate in the plan, and earn credited service. And that's all on page 6 of the Guide to Clergy Benefits. Okay, so you'll notice that there was no dollar figure mentioned in any of those descriptions. When we made changes in the pension plan in 2018, in order to accommodate part-time or bivocational clerics, we took away that dollar figure. So let's go on to the next slide to talk about inactive, what happens when we go to inactive service. So on pages 8 and 9 of the Clergy Guide, it talks about, if you become inactive, you're going to lose some of the benefits that we offer. One of them is that resettlement benefit, which is a one-time lump sum payment that the cleric receives at a time of retirement. It could be up to a maximum of $20,000. So if you retire in inactive status, meaning you're no longer active, you really don't get that resettlement benefit. We can go back one slide, please, Cindy. That'd be great. Something else you would not earn if you go inactive, is you would not have the life insurance built into your pension plan. So there are a number of ancillary benefits that we provide to active clergy that you will lose if you go inactive. So in conversations I have with clerics, the goal is try to stay active, try to earn as much credited service as you can, and what are the strategies and options available to you. So if you want to go into greater detail about what you lose by going inactive, that would be pages 8 and 9 of the Clergy Guide to Benefits, okay? And there's a chat here that question and answers. I should be answering answers and questions at the end of the presentation. Okay, so keep those questions handy. And then at the end, when we open this up to questions and answers, that's when you can type in your questions. Thank you, Cindy. So earning credited service during your times of transition. Let's talk about one opportunity that's outlined on the next slide. If there's a break in service, so this provision will apply to clergy between cures, taking any unpaid leave, if a cleric is suspended or restricted from exercising ministry in the Episcopal Church. So the option is you could set up what is known as a between cures account, and it's good for up to 24 months. So let's talk about a situation. A cleric's position just ended, and now they're looking around for another position. For the first 6 months, where there are no assessments being paid, the clergy is considered to be active in this grace period. But one day after 6 months, they become inactive and they lose some of those ancillary benefits we talked about, like the life insurance, like the resettlement benefit. So if a cleric is in that position where they see they're closing in on that 6-month grace period, They could have a conversation with myself or call up client services and say, I want to set up a between cures account. So what that means now is that the clerk will be paying assessments on their own behalf to stay active while they're looking around for another position. And they could do that for up to 24 months at a time. And they could do it as many times in their career as they want. All right. So what's the number of what that would cost to do that? When you're setting up a between cures account, you could either calculate the assessment 18% for cleric's HAC, highest average compensation, or on the hypothetical minimum salary of $18,000 a year. So 18% of $18,000 a year is $270 a month. Okay. And basically that comes to like over 24 months, 6,000 and change. The one conversation when I have with clerics and my colleagues do, and certainly when we go to our conferences and we talk about emergency accounts, you have an emergency fund set up. One such fund might be money put aside in order to maybe pay for these personal assessments if you find yourself in a between cures account. So that would be $270 a month times 24 months, roughly $6,000 for those 24 months. Okay. Now there may be a need where it might make sense for the cleric to pay the 18% on their highest average compensation, their HAC. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. So again, the grace period, 6 months. And again, you could be using this as often as you need during your career. Okay. So next slide, please. So makeup accounts. This is a situation, a provision in our plan where you may be able to pay personal assessments to increase your credited service. Eligibility would be based on the pension rules at the time the credited service was earned. Interest may be charged, and you can certainly call client services or myself and my colleagues about how this works. So let's talk about an example. Let's say I have a financial conversation with the clerk and we review their work history, and it turns out that there are a couple of years where they only received partial credited service. For one reason or another, it doesn't really matter. One reason could be they stepped away from the church because they were raising a family at home, or maybe their employer neglected to pay some assessments. And back in earlier versions of the pension plan, when there were dollars amounts assigned to credited service, perhaps the clerk didn't earn the full amount to get the full accredited service. Just to give an example, let's say that number for the pension plan to earn credited service in those particular years was, I don't know, let's say $30,000. And if the cleric only made $25,000, even though they worked for full 12 months, they wouldn't get a full year of credited service just because of that dollar number. But again, currently now, there is no more dollar figure. So when I review a cleric's history, and there are a couple of gaps where they didn't receive a full year of credited service, what we can do is we could do the research and calculate, is the cleric eligible to make up that account based on the rules when that credited service occurred or lack of credited service occurred. And if they are eligible, what would it cost to make it a full year? And that cost would include any interest, because if it's older than 2 years from today, we have to start charging you interest. And how much credited service would you earn by paying that money? So let's say there are 3 or 4 gaps in the cleric's career, and let's just say that they are all eligible based on the rules at that time for a makeup account. Then what we'll do is we'll say, okay, for the gap in this year, if you give us X amount of dollars, you'll get half a year of credited service. And then I'll say for this other gap in this other year, if you give us X amount of dollars, you might earn a 30th year of accredited service. Another one might say, if you give us X amount of dollars, you'll earn 1 month credited service. So when the clerk receives that letter, when I put in the request for the calculation to be done, I often ask to get a copy of that letter so then I could have a follow-up conversation with the clerk to go over the cost value of whether it makes sense to pay that money to get that credited service. So when the clerk reviews these numbers, they could either choose to pay all of them, they could choose to pay none of them, or they could just choose to pay 1 or 2 where they get the biggest bang for their buck, so to speak. So let's just pick some numbers to make an example. Let's say all 3 of these gaps of partial years of credited service are eligible for a makeup account. And let's say the numbers come in. If you give the church pension fund, $7,000, you'll get 1.5 years more of credited service. So what does that really mean? It means that you had to pay up front $7,000. We'll make those partial years full years, and you now just earned 1.5 years more of credited service. But how does a cleric decide, is it worth it to get that 1.5 years if I have to pay $7,000 up front? So what you could do is you could use our pension calculator, and let's just say right now today, that cleric would retire at 65 with 20 years of credited service. And we can see what the numbers would look like, okay, with the pension plan. And then in order to work around the calculator, you could say, well, let's assume I had 1.5 years more of credited service. So instead of retiring at 65, you're now retiring at 66.5, because the calculator doesn't allow you to add credited service by adding that extra 1.5 years to the end. Basically, you're saying, okay, if you retired at age 66.5, you have that extra 1.5 years of credited service. So what would those numbers be like? Okay, so now what you would then do is compare those two numbers, what you would get at 65 and what you would get with that extra 1.5 years of credited service at the age of 66.5. So let's just say your pension would increase by $100 a month, okay, $1,200 a year. So now you're thinking, okay, so if I'm getting more of a pension for $1,200 a year, that would mean I'd need about 6 years to make back the $7,000 I paid up front. Okay, for a cleric, that might say, yeah, that makes sense. You know, if I retire at 65, by the time I'm 71, I'll have made back the $7,000 I put up front. And because I have longevity genes in my family and I expect to be around in my 90s, it makes sense. But if you do the math and it says to break even, you have to be 400 years old, then obviously it doesn't make sense. So basically, that's the kind of conversation I would have with the cleric when reviewing their work history to see if it makes sense to pay those personal makeup accounts. So when you are working with a cleric and you're talking about transition from one position to another, we now know that between Cures account is eligible, available. You set it up for 24 months, then they could find new employment. And then if that new employment ends after a year or two, or maybe it's just an interim gig, but at least somebody's paying the assessments, meaning the employer, then if they find another gap, they could set up another between Cures accounts. You could do 24 months maximum at a time, and you could do it as many times in your career as required or necessary. Okay. So something else you might have a conversation with is sometimes when a cleric moves from one position to another position, the employer they left may not have paid the last assessment, or the employer they're going to may not have started paying assessments early enough. So there could be a gap right there. So that might be something that we want to keep track of, and the cleric should be mindful of to make sure that the assessments are being paid up to when the contract stipulates that they no longer pay or when they do start paying. So that's something else to think about during a transition, okay? So that was a between Cures account, and that was makeup account. So let's move on to the next slide. Extension history. This is the definition. You're in good standing, you're active, you're ordained ministry, but you want to work outside the Episcopal Church. So what that means is if your job ends and you can't find a position inside the Episcopal Church, where in some parts of the rural America, it could be a challenge to find another position nearby. But let's just say that there's a hospital down the street that needs a minister. You could apply to be that minister for that church position, for that hospital position. And let's assume then that you do get accepted for that position. You can then come to CPG and say, I'm a minister at hospital, but I'm still performing my ministry. I want it to count towards my pension plan. So in this example, being a minister or let's just say a chaplain at an organization like that, you probably would get approval by the committee here at CPG saying, okay, that's cool, that's an extension of ministry. But then we're going to ask, who's paying the assessments? Okay, so in this position, as a chaplain at a hospital, let's say, if you can negotiate with the hospital while they pay the assessments on the salary to us, that would be fabulous. But in the real world, that doesn't happen too often. Most hospitals might have their own retirement plan, and they'll say, no, we're okay with maybe putting some contribution into the 403B plan that the hospital has, but we're not going to be paying 18% of your salary to church pension group. But maybe then the cleric could say, well, what if we split it 50-50, with the hospital pays half and I pay half? That might be a negotiating that you could do. But worst case scenario, if the hospital says no, the cleric could pay the assessments themselves, 18% of their salary as a chaplain at the hospital position. So the benefit to that would be you're staying active, so you don't lose any of the other benefits we talked about. You're earning credited service. Your hack might go up based on that salary, but it certainly wouldn't go down. So there are a lot of pluses for setting up and applying for that extension of ministry. So the way you do it would be, there's a form on our website. You download the form, fill it out, explain what the position is, job description, salary, blah, blah, blah. You have your bishop, and it says here, the canonical bishop or the geographic bishop, to sign off saying, yeah, I agree, this is an extension of ministry. You submit the form to CPG. There's a committee that reviews that. We review everything, and then we'll say, yes, this is an extension of ministry, or no. If it is an extension of ministry, then it's good for 2 years, and you can keep renewing every 2 years. At that point, I would imagine it's just filling out the form again. It's pretty standard. And then if you find another position at another position, extension of ministry, you fill out the form again, all right? So that's a fabulous benefit that maybe not everybody is aware of. And I'm just using an example as a chaplain at a hospital, but there are many other positions that might very well be eligible to be an extension of ministry. Maybe you're teaching comparative religion at a local college. I don't know, it could be work. Or you're teaching at a parochial school, that might be an option. I've had conversations with some clerics who have credentials to do counseling. So they could set up an office where they do marriage counseling, and they bring in their ministry. And that's what they describe in the extension of ministry form. Bishop says, yes, I agree. So basically, there's a lot of flexibility as to what you could submit with regard to an extension of ministry. And, you can see what happens. And if you want to get a sense or a feeling about whether that job description you're thinking of would be applicable, that could be a time for a conversation as well. Okay. So next slide, please. This is the pension formula. HAC is your high-risk average compensation, and that's described as 7 12-month periods. Those 12-month periods do not have to be, we could cherry pick those 7 12-month periods during a cleric's entire year. They do no longer have to be consecutive 12 months, one after the other, okay? And then we multiply it times years of credited service. That's what the CS stands for. And that's why setting up a between cures account to stay active to get more accredited service, doing the extension of ministry, maybe purchasing to make up some partial years of accredited service to get that number higher, because you can see it now, it's the denominator. The higher the number for credited services, the higher your pension, and then it's times 1.6, which is actuarial number that we use. And then the second half of the formula is you take $10,000, the first $10,000 of a cleric's hack, you multiply it again times credited service, and you multiply it times another actuarial number, 1.1.5, add those two numbers together, and that's the pension. Okay, so to review, highest 12-month period, they could be anywhere in the career, they cannot overlap, so it's a 7 12-month highest earning years, okay? And if a cleric happened to retire with only 6 years or 5 years, because they came as a second career or a third career, then we'll take the average of those 5 or 6 years. But the goal would be, the ideal would be 7 12-month periods, non-overlapping, non-consecutive in this example, okay? Someone might ask, well, why is the second step put in there, the 10,000? That's to help benefit cleric who have a low hack because they might be working for many years in rural parts where their salary may not be as high as in other parts of the country. So this gives a little bit of a bump. Okay, next slide, please. So additional retirement savings opportunities. I hope everyone is familiar with the RSVP plan that we offer. It's a retirement savings vehicle. It's basically a 403B plan, which means that the money goes in pre-tax with a limit of $20,500 or 100% of salary. That number, $20,500, is based on IRS rules, so it does change over time. If you're over age 50, you're allowed to contribute an additional $6,500. No federal income taxes or secret taxes are paid by the clergy on the pre-tax contributions. And as long as you withdraw it after age 59 and a half, there are no penalties. But if you don't take distributions by the time you turn 72, the IRS rules require you to start taking out what's known as required minimum distributions at age 72. So I've been asked by clerics in my conversations, well, do I have to open up a new RSVP every time I change employers? No. Basically, the RSVP plan is set up one time in your career, hopefully in the beginning, and it's basically attached to your social security number. So anytime you move positions within the Episcopal Church and between employers, the RSVP plan moves with you. So you can just set it up once and then bring it with you to every employer and continue making contributions with each employer when you sign a contract and start working for them. Okay. I know I've had conversations with clerics not getting into this because they think they have to do it every time they change, but no. Once you set it up, and the earlier your career, the better, it'll move with you through all your decisions. Now, if you're in an extension of ministry, I don't think you'd be able to contribute to it because in this example we've been using, the hospital, they have their own 403B plan, so I doubt if they would agree to contributing to yours. But if they do contribute to the 403B plan with that church, with their pension plan there, then I would say then that'd be something to enroll in. That'd be great. So I'm often asked, well, if I have a 403B with another employer, can I roll it over into the RSVP? And that could be a whole nother seminar, and we touch on that briefly when we talk about the taxes on the pension plan and all that. But the short answer is if that 403B is with a secular employer, then it would not be a good idea to roll that money into the RSVP plan. If that 403B came from another religious organization, then you probably would be able to roll it into our plan. But before you do so, it would be a good idea to have a conversation with myself and my colleagues to see if it makes sense from a tax rules perspective. Okay. So we can go on to the next slide, please. So we're coming up now to where we provide tools and resources to everyone in order to get more information, a better education, a resource with regard to the pension plan and all the ins and outs. We have an e-learning library. As of now, there's 17 courses and more to come. And they're about a whole bunch of different things. Something about Social Security, nutrition, understanding the international clergy pension plan, how to protect yourself from financial fraud. So these are really valuable. They're short, so you could take them in during the lunch break or quickly, and it's a great resource. We even have one in there about the clergy housing allowance. So please take yourself available of this stuff. We keep adding new ones, updating old ones, so it's fabulous for you. Okay, next slide. We have a series of conversations with experts in the field of health, education, finance, hopefully to get you to maybe focus more on mindfulness, living a healthier lifestyle, all that stuff. So these are podcasts that are also available to you. You can listen to at any time. And there's the link, choosewell.podbean.com. Okay. Our regular resources were located in New York. Phone number for client services, for tax-related questions, and they must be clergy specific. They can't be general. We have this tax hotline. They're open all year round, not just from January to April. You can call them with your tax questions to see, what their options are. The tax hotline people will not do your tax return, but they'll give you an education and turn you on to other resources to help guide a cleric do their taxes. The tax hotline people would be happy to speak to a cleric's own tax preparer if that tax preparer has questions. So it's a great resource to make available year round for you. Okay. And there's a picture of myself and Anna Mullen. We're available for financial conversations anytime during the year. Just call client services, say you want to have a chat with one of us, and we could have a conversation about any financial related question not only about the pension plan, but about claiming strategies for Social Security, outside investments, all that kind of good stuff. You could also follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And again, everyone has their own personal MyCPG account. Every clerk has one, so they could always log in to see what their pension plan looks like, to make sure that they're not in arrears for assessments being paid, get an idea of what they might expect for a pension when they retire. And we also, again, have the pension calculator that we use, that a clerk can use at any time to do some number crunching as well. Next slide. This is a disclaimer where this is not investment advice or tax advice. It's basically an education